She walked through the doors of the old concert hall with her bag slung over her shoulder in a calmness that surprised everyone who glanced her way. The hall smelled faintly of polished wood and old velvet, the kind of place that carried memories of performances past. People were scattered around, some chatting in small groups, some practicing quietly on their instruments, and others just observing the room, sizing up the competition. Her eyes scanned the space for a moment, taking in the crowded chairs, the stage with its grand piano, and the people who seemed too busy showing off to notice her. She didn't hurry. She didn't need to. There was a quiet confidence in her stride that made her seem almost invisible, yet fully present at the same time. As she walked past the rows of performers warming up, a man sitting in the front row couldn't help but notice her. He was older, confident, and had an air of authority about him. He had been attending these events for years, playing in competitions himself, and judging talent even unofficially. When he saw her, he chuckled under his breath, tilting his head as if to say, "This will be amusing." She wasn't flashy, she wasn't loud, and she certainly didn't look like a serious performer in his eyes. To him, she seemed like just another dreamer who would soon embarrass herself. Meanwhile, she found a quiet corner to set down her bag. She pulled out a notebook and a pencil, jotting down a few notes about the performance ahead. She didn't talk to anyone. She didn't need to. Her focus was inward. Years of practice had taught her the importance of preparation, patience, and presence. Every sound she had played in her life had led her to this small, quiet moment. She could hear the soft laughter and murmurs from the man and a few others around him. But she didn't let it reach her thoughts. She knew their doubt was not hers to carry. People continued to bustle around the hall. A few performers played scales loudly, hoping to intimidate the newcomers. Some tried to get attention by showing off technical tricks, hitting high notes and fast passages that were more about speed than feeling. She observed quietly, noting the nervous tension in some faces and the forced confidence in others. She realized that the performance wasn't just about music. It was about courage, about stepping forward when all eyes were on you. It's about carrying your story through every note. The man who had laughed now whispered to a friend beside him, gesturing toward her. He made a joke, low enough for her not to hear directly, but the intention was clear. They both laughed softly, eyes fixed on her. She didn't flinch, didn't react, and kept her focus. There was a deep understanding within her that mockery often comes from fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of being outdone. She had encountered it before, in classrooms, competitions, in casual gatherings where people had underestimated her just because of how she looked or how quiet she seemed. But she had learned something important from those experiences. The right moment would always speak louder than words or laughter. She glanced at the grand piano on the stage. Its black and white keys glistened under the soft overhead lights. She had spent countless hours on instruments just like this one, but somehow this piano felt different. It seemed to hum with expectation. It's almost inviting her to come forward and show what she had learned. It's not for anyone's approval, but for the purity of the music itself. Her heart beat steadily, not with anxiety, but with readiness. Every time she approached a piano, it was like entering a dialogue, a conversation where emotion and skill met. She could feel it even now, the quiet energy that the room held, waiting to be awakened by someone willing to listen and respond. Around her, the performers continued their warm-ups. Some noticed her, some didn't. Whispers occasionally traveled across the room, but she ignored them. Her mind was already forming the first lines of music she would play. It was simple, yet precise. A melody that had been carefully refined over months of practice. It wasn't about impressing the audience with complexity. It was about expressing the story she carried within her. She closed her eyes for a moment and imagined the sound, feeling each note as it would travel through the air, touch the listeners, and maybe even catch someone off guard in the best possible way. Back in the front row, the man continued his quiet commentary, expecting the performance to be laughable. He leaned back, shaking his head slightly, thinking this would be an easy moment of entertainment. But deep down, he had attended enough performances to know that appearances could be deceiving. Still, he chose to focus on the obvious first impressions. The young woman seemed too quiet, too small, too unassuming to make a mark. He didn't realize that these assumptions, so easily formed, could be the very thing that made the moment remarkable when proven wrong. Time passed and more performers went on stage. Applause echoed, some timid, some enthusiastic. She observed everything, noting the reactions of the audience, the way the performers handled the spotlight, the small mistakes and the moments of brilliance. Each experience added to her understanding, preparing her mind for the moment when she herself would be called. She wasn't nervous, at least not in the way others might be. There was a calm determination in her, a steady patience that came from years of silently building skill and character. When her name was finally called, a hush fell over the small crowd. Some glanced up from their conversations. Some paused mid-action to watch. She stood, picked up her bag, and walked toward the stage with a measured pace. The man in the front row leaned forward, curiosity mixed with amusement. He still didn't expect much. People turned their heads, some whispering about how unremarkable she seemed. But the woman didn't notice them, didn't engage with the murmurs. Her attention was solely on the piano ahead, on the music that was about to come alive through her hands. As she approached the piano, she noticed the intricate details on its surface, the reflection of lights dancing off the polished wood. She took a deep breath, feeling the familiar thrill of readiness. It wasn't fear, it was the anticipation of creating something beautiful in a space that had witnessed countless performances, each leaving its mark in some way. She placed her hands gently on the keys, feeling the coolness under her fingers, letting the instrument respond to her touch even before she played a single note. The audience, initially distracted by chatter and side conversations, began to quiet down as the subtle presence of someone about to perform demanded attention. There was a shift in the energy of the room, almost imperceptible at first, but tangible. People leaned forward slightly, curiosity replacing casual disinterest. The man in the front row frowned slightly, sensing that this moment might not unfold as he had expected. There was a calm in her movements that hinted at control, at skill, at an understanding of music that was deeper than he had allowed himself to anticipate. She adjusted the bench slightly, placed her feet comfortably, and closed her eyes for a brief second. Feeling the rhythm in her mind, the room seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't just a piano she was about to play, it was a culmination of every quiet practice session. Every note repeated hundreds of times, every moment of being underestimated and overlooked. She opened her eyes, glanced at the keys, and for the first time, allowed herself to imagine the sound traveling across the hall. Touching the ears and hearts of everyone present, the man in the front row leaned back, crossing his arms with a smirk, fully prepared to enjoy the entertainment of someone failing. He didn't realize that his laughter, his doubt, his casual judgment would have no bearing on what was about to unfold. The other performers paused in their practice, some looking up with mild curiosity. There was a collective awareness, subtle but growing, that something different was about to happen. She took a final deep breath and let her hands hover above the keys. The moment stretched just long enough to feel significant, filled with a quiet tension and possibility. The hall seemed to pulse softly with expectation. And then, with the first gentle press of a key, the silence began to change. The sound that emerged was not loud. It was not flashy. It was not demanding attention. It simply existed, perfectly balanced, controlled, and pure. The audience, unaware at first of what had just begun, began to feel the shift. The laughter and amusement faded into stillness, replaced by curiosity, by the sense that something genuine and extraordinary was starting to unfold. Everything in that moment, the smell of the hall, the quiet determination in her movements, the slight tension in the audience, and even the man's lingering amusement was about to change. The first note had been played. It carried with it the promise that the story of this performance was not going to be what anyone had expected. And as the sound lingered, stretching across the room, one thing became clear. This quiet young woman, underestimated by many, was about to make them rethink everything they thought they knew about talent, patience, and the power of presence. The moment she took her seat at the piano, the room seemed to hold its breath. The soft chatter that had floated across the hall moments before was replaced by a tense silence. Everyone turned their attention toward her, the young woman who appeared quiet, unassuming, and unprepared, at least to the casual eye. The man in the front row, who had laughed and whispered jokes about her mere presence, leaned forward with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. He had seen countless performers before, some confident, some talented, some simply lucky. He was ready to enjoy another misstep, performance that would allow him to shake his head and return to his own sense of superiority. But something in the way she sat, the calm in her posture, made him pause ever so slightly. It was not confidence that radiated from her, nor arrogance. It was a quiet, steady determination, something he wasn't accustomed to noticing in someone so unassuming. She looked out at the audience for a brief moment, scanning the rows of faces. Some were distracted, chatting quietly among themselves, others fidgeting, waiting for the next performance. Her gaze was gentle, unthreatening, yet there was a sense of clarity in the way she observed the room. She wasn't intimidated by the crowd. She didn't need their approval. Every note she had played before this had been for herself, for the music itself, for the story embedded in each melody she had learned to play. The room was merely a space for that story to reach ears willing to listen. She could feel the anticipation building, not hers, but the energy in the room. It was a weightless tension, electric, but not hostile. She welcomed it. The man in the front row exchanged another quiet comment with his companion. "Watch this," he whispered, a smirk playing on his lips. "This will be over in a minute." His companion nodded, both expecting amusement. They had never considered the possibility that someone could quietly sit and, with no grand gestures or theatrics, command the room. In their experience, performers either shouted for attention or failed. She didn't appear to be the former, and her calmness made them certain she would be the latter. Around her, other performers continued to practice, some casting curious glances her way. Sensing that this performance might not be ordinary, there was a quiet buzz of anticipation, subtle but growing, as if the room itself was bracing for something it could not yet name. She could hear faint whispers, the scraping of chairs, the soft tuning of instruments. Every small sound became part of the environment she had to navigate, and she did so with complete focus. This was not a performance of speed or spectacle. It was a test of presence, patience, and authenticity. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting her hands hover above the keys. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly, not with fear, but with the excitement of expression. She could feel the journey of every note she was about to play. She thought of the countless hours she had spent alone with her music, the late nights when her fingers ached and her mind tired, the silent victories when a difficult passage finally came together. Each of those moments had brought her here, to a quiet hall filled with strangers who didn't yet understand what was about to unfold. The first few seconds after she pressed a key were crucial. The note emerged softly, pure and clear. It resonated through the hall, and the effect was immediate. Some heads turned, some whispered, and the smirk of the man in the front row faltered just slightly. The sound was not loud or boastful, but it was perfect. It carried intention, emotion, and a depth that the casual observer could not ignore. He shifted in his seat, leaning forward, trying to understand how a performer so quiet and seemingly inexperienced could create such a presence. The laughter he had expected vanished completely, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. She continued to play, each note deliberate, each phrase carefully shaped. Her music was not about technical fireworks, but about emotional resonance. She played with precision, control, and subtlety, each chord an arpeggio, weaving a story of patience, hope, and resilience. The audience began to change, unconsciously leaning forward, drawn into the unfolding soundscape. There were no dramatic gestures, no flashy tricks, only the truth of her music. And yet that truth was powerful enough to command attention, to shift the room from casual chatter to quiet admiration. The man in the front row could no longer maintain his smug composure. His smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by a look of concentration, surprise, and slowly, respect. He had underestimated her, as he had underestimated many others before, and the realization hit him hard. He tried to analyze what he was hearing, searching for flaws or weaknesses, but each note only reinforced the undeniable skill and emotion she brought to the performance. He felt an unfamiliar sensation, a mixture of humility and awe that made him question the assumptions he had carried in 4 years. As the music progressed, the audience became increasingly absorbed. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound fill their minds. Others sat silently, captivated by the subtle dynamics, the delicate phrasing, and the intensity of feeling behind every key press. There was an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, a collective acknowledgement that this performance was unlike any other that day. People who had arrived with preconceptions and casual judgment found themselves reconsidering, reflecting on their own expectations and the ease with which they had assumed they could predict her performance. She moved through the pieces with grace, each transition seamless, each note purposeful. Her body language was calm, hands steady, eyes occasionally glancing at the keys but mostly connected to the music itself. She seemed to inhabit the piano entirely, as if her thoughts, emotions, and experiences were flowing directly into each sound. The room, once filled with skepticism and idle chatter, was now united in attention. Every listener, whether they realized it or not, was participating in a shared experience, experiencing something raw, authentic, and quietly extraordinary. The man in the front row, who had once laughed at the idea of her performing, now felt a growing sense of admiration. He could see the depth of preparation, the subtle control, and the emotional truth she conveyed through her fingers. It was not just skill. It was understanding, empathy, and lived experience translated into music. He realized that he had judged prematurely, that appearances were often deceiving, and that real talent sometimes arrives silently, waiting for a moment to reveal itself. As the final chords of her first piece faded, a hush lingered in the air. No one moved immediately. No one spoke. It was a moment of suspended reality, a pause that allowed the impact of what they had just heard to settle. The man in the front row exhaled slowly, his mind racing with the recognition that he had witnessed something unexpected. The young woman had taken her place at the piano quietly, faced doubt and judgment, and had begun to change the perceptions of everyone present with nothing more than her music and presence. She did not smile or boast. She simply took a breath and prepared for the next piece. Her focus never wavered, her concentration unwavering. She knew that the audience's attention, their respect, and their surprise were byproducts of her commitment to the music, not the goal itself. Every note was a statement, every phrase a reflection of her dedication and years of perseverance. The performance had only begun, yet already the room felt transformed, the energy shifted, and assumptions quietly dismantled around the hall. Performers and observers alike were paying closer attention. Those who had initially whispered or joked now watched with genuine curiosity and anticipation. There was a subtle understanding growing among them, an unspoken recognition that they were witnessing more than just a recital. They were witnessing someone who had endured quiet preparation, someone who had faced doubt and judgment countless times, and someone who had emerged with a presence that demanded attention without demanding applause. And in that moment, the man in the front row, whose laughter had set the stage for this transformation, felt something shift inside him. He had entered the hall with assumptions, ready to dismiss her, ready to be entertained by failure. Instead, he found himself confronted with authenticity, skill, and emotional truth. He realized that talent could not be measured by appearance or confidence alone. That quiet determination often carried more weight than bravado, and that a single person, fully committed to their craft, could change the room's perception in ways that no sarcasm or mockery could anticipate. As she moved into her second piece, the room remained captivated. There was a subtle energy that bound everyone present together, a shared awareness that this performance was extraordinary. She played with a quiet intensity, each note deliberate, each phrase shaped with care. The music was a conversation, a story unfolding in real time, a reflection of every experience that had brought her to this moment. And as she played, the audience listened. Not as critics or casual observers, but as participants in a shared journey. Drawn into the depth and sincerity of her expression, By the end of this part of her performance, the room had transformed. Doubt, laughter, and casual judgment had been replaced by attentiveness, reflection, and admiration. She had not sought to prove anyone wrong, yet she had done so simply by being herself and allowing her music to speak. The man in the front row, once amused, now sat quietly, humbled, and thoughtful. Recognizing the lesson unfolding before him, never underestimate someone based on appearance, confidence, or silence. True talent, patience, and authenticity reveal themselves in time, often in ways that surpass expectation and leave a lasting impression on everyone. Present, she began her third piece with a calm confidence, the kind that comes from countless hours spent alone with music, perfecting every nuance and detail. Her fingers moved across the keys with grace, each note deliberate, each pause carefully measured. The hall was silent, the audience completely absorbed, and even the man in the front row who had laughed at her earlier seemed caught in the spell she was weaving. He leaned forward, eyes fixed, trying to understand how someone so quiet and unassuming could create such a commanding presence. It wasn't just technical skill that drew him in. It was the emotion behind each note, the sincerity of every sound. The story embedded in the music she was telling, the young woman played with a quiet intensity, her hands flowing effortlessly across the keys. The music was not meant to dazzle with speed or complexity, but to communicate something deeper, something human and relatable. She had learned long ago that true expression comes not from the applause or approval of others, but from the connection between the performer and the instrument, the performer and the music, and ultimately, the performer and the audience. She felt the energy of the room shift subtly with every note, the quiet curiosity growing into attentive focus. People who had come in skeptical now leaned forward, their eyes widening, their attention undivided. She had prepared herself for doubt and judgment, for the sneers and smirks she often encountered, and yet she didn't need to confront them directly. Her music spoke louder than words ever could. The first few notes had already silenced the laughter. And now, as the piece unfolded, the emotional depth of her performance began to leave an impression on every listener. She played with a sense of purpose, each chord carrying intention, each melody conveying the years of practice, the moments of frustration, and the triumphs of mastering difficult passages. She allowed herself to be fully present, to feel every sound resonate through her body and into the hall. The man in the front row could no longer maintain his detachment. His earlier amusement had vanished completely, replaced by a growing awareness that he had underestimated her. He tried to find flaws, to catch a mistake, but there were none. Every movement of her hands, every subtle shift in dynamics, every carefully measured pause demonstrated mastery and understanding beyond what he had expected. He felt a sense of humility wash over him, realizing that his assumptions about appearances and quiet demeanor had led him astray. He had laughed, thinking she would fail, yet here she was, proving with every note that skill and authenticity cannot be judged by first impressions. Around the hall, the audience was equally captivated. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them, while others sat in silence, hanging on every phrase. The atmosphere had changed completely from the casual chatter and whispers that had filled the space before. There was a shared understanding, unspoken but palpable, that something extraordinary was happening. People who had arrived with preconceived notions were now forced to reconsider, to acknowledge the talent and dedication that could not be denied. Even those who had been indifferent, distracted, or critical were caught up in the emotion of the performance. Unable to look away, she continued to play, each passage flowing naturally into the next. Her hands moved with precision, yet they were never mechanical. There was warmth and life in every touch, a sense of humanity that made the music feel alive. She had learned that technique alone was not enough. The heart behind the music was what truly connected with listeners. She had spent years practicing not just the notes, but the feeling, the expression, the subtle nuances that bring music to life. And now, in this moment, all of that preparation was coming together in a performance that transcended expectation. The man in the front row could no longer resist the impact of what he was witnessing. He found himself leaning forward, eyes fixed on her hands on the piano. on the subtle expressions that accompanied each phrase. He realized that he had never truly appreciated this kind of quiet mastery, this understated yet powerful presence. He had laughed, thinking her small frame and calm demeanor were signs of weakness. But now he was confronted with the truth. Strength and brilliance often come in quiet forms, and it is easy to overlook until it reveals itself unexpectedly. She moved through the piece with an effortless grace, each note balanced and measured, each phrase flowing naturally. The music was not just sound. It was a story, a reflection of her journey, her dedication, her love for the art. The hall seemed to vibrate with the subtle intensity of her playing, the silence of the audience amplifying every note. There was a rhythm to the space itself, a sense that time had slowed to allow the music to breathe, to take shape fully, and to touch the hearts of those listening. People felt drawn into the story she was telling, feeling the emotions behind the sound without needing words. The man in the front row, now completely absorbed, felt a shift within himself. He had come expecting entertainment at someone else's expense, yet he was finding something far more profound. He realized that his laughter and judgment had been misplaced, that talent and authenticity cannot be measured by outward appearances alone. He felt a mixture of awe and humility, recognizing that he had been given a lesson in perception, patience, the transformative power of art. The young woman at the piano had done more than play music. She had changed the energy of the room, reshaped expectations, and reminded everyone present of the importance of giving people the chance to reveal their true potential. She played on, completely immersed in the music, unaware of the impact she was having on the audience. Each note was deliberate, each pause intentional, each transition carefully crafted to convey emotion and story. The subtle shifts in dynamics, the delicate phrasing, the controlled tempo of it combined to create a performance that was both technically precise and deeply moving. She had learned through experience that the true measure of skill is not how fast or complex one can play, but how effectively one can communicate feeling and connect with others through sound. And in this moment, she was succeeding beyond measure. The audience felt the shift in energy as the performance continued. Those who had been skeptical, indifferent, or dismissive were now fully engaged, drawn into the music and the story it told. They were witnesses to something rare, a performance that combined technical mastery with emotional depth, delivered by someone who did not need to shout or boast, someone whose quiet presence spoke volumes. The man in the front row could no longer contain his admiration. He watched closely, analyzing not to criticize, but to understand, to grasp the skill, patience, and authenticity that had initially escaped his notice. She had prepared herself not just for the notes, but for the experience of performing in front of an audience that might doubt her abilities. She had learned that true confidence comes from preparation and inner belief, not from the approval of others. Every note she played was a testament to years of dedication, perseverance, and quiet determination. She understood the power of patience, the value of persistence, and the strength that comes from believing in oneself, even when others do not. And now, as she continued her performance, that strength became palpable, resonating through the hall and touching everyone present. The man in the front row, who had laughed and whispered jokes only minutes before, now sat humbled. He felt the weight of his own assumptions, the realization that he had judged prematurely. The young woman's performance was not just a display of skill. It was a demonstration of resilience, of the power of silent determination, and of the ability to command attention through authenticity rather than theatrics. He had underestimated her, and in doing so, he had learned an important lesson. Never dismiss someone based on appearances, assumptions, or first impressions. True talent often reveals itself quietly, and when it does, it can silence even the loudest doubts. As she approached the final measures of the piece, the room was completely still. Every listener was focused, not out of obligation, but out of genuine captivation. The music had taken on a life of its own, carrying the emotions, experiences, and dedication of the performer into the hearts of those who heard it. She felt the energy of the audience, the subtle shifts in their focus, and the growing appreciation of her skill. She did not let it distract her. Instead, it reinforced the importance of what she was doing, of the connection she was creating through her music. When the final notes lingered in the air, there was a moment of absolute silence. No one moved, no one spoke. The impact of the performance was evident in the stillness, in the expressions of awe, in the quiet realization that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The man in the front row exhaled slowly, his mind racing with reflection. He had come expecting amusement, yet he had been given inspiration. He had doubted, and yet he had been proven wrong in the most profound way. The young woman had done nothing more than play from her heart. Yet she had changed the room, altered perceptions, and commanded respect without ever raising her voice or demanding attention. She took a breath, allowing the silence to settle, feeling the connection she had established without the need for words. Her performance was not about proving anyone wrong, but it had done so effortlessly. The audience, once skeptical and distracted, now sat in quiet admiration, recognizing the depth, dedication, and authenticity that had been on display. Even the man who had laughed could not deny the impact of her music, the power of her presence, and the undeniable skill that had been underestimated at first glance. And as she prepared for the next piece, there was a subtle understanding in the room that this performance was not just music, it was a story of resilience, quiet strength, and the transformative power of authenticity. She had begun to change perceptions, not through words or confrontation, but through her dedication, skill, and the emotion she conveyed with every note. The man in the front row, once a skeptic, knew as she began the fourth piece. The atmosphere in the hall had completely transformed. The initial skepticism, the quiet laughter, and the casual judgment had all but disappeared, replaced by a quiet reverence. Every listener was leaning slightly forward, their attention fully captured by the young woman at the piano. The man in the front row, who had once been so certain she would fail, now sat rigid with focus, unable to tear his eyes away. Each note she played seemed to carry a weight, a depth, and a meaning that made the audience sit in awe. He had laughed, thinking she was unprepared, inexperienced, or lacking skill, yet now he understood that he had been completely wrong. She had stepped onto the stage not to impress or dominate, but to share something genuine. And that authenticity was more powerful than anything he could have anticipated. The young woman's hands moved effortlessly across the keys. The music she played was not about speed or spectacle, but about conveying feeling, telling a story, and connecting with everyone listening. Each phrase seemed to flow naturally, as if she was drawing not only from her technical ability, but from the very core of her experiences. She had faced doubt and dismissal before, moments when people had assumed she couldn't succeed, and she had learned the quiet power of patience and perseverance. All of that preparation, all of that experience, was now speaking through her music. The audience could feel it, even if they could not name exactly why. The man in the front row, now fully absorbed, could not help but analyze every detail. He studied her hand movements, the subtle expressions on her face, the way she leaned into certain passages and relaxed in others. He realized that what made her performance extraordinary was not just skill, but the thought and feeling behind each note. The laughter that had once come so easily now felt like a distant memory. He had underestimated her not because of her ability, but because he had assumed that appearances and confidence alone could predict success. And now, he was forced to reconsider everything he had taken for granted about talent, and the quiet power it can carry. The audience around him was equally captivated. People who had come expecting a routine performance were now drawn into the music, their attention unwavering. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them, while others sat rigidly, absorbing every nuance. Conversations had ceased entirely. The subtle shifts in tempo, the careful phrasing, and the dynamic control of her playing created an invisible thread connecting everyone in the hall. Her music was not just notes. It was emotion, experience, and truth woven together into something tangible. Every listener felt the impact, whether they realized it or not. As the room was transformed by her presence and dedication, she played with a quiet intensity, never forcing the music, never seeking attention beyond what the piano and the melody demanded. Her focus was absolute, and her body language reflected the complete immersion she felt in the performance. She was not performing for validation or praise. She was performing because the music demanded it, because her years of practice had prepared her for this exact moment. And in doing so, she had an effect far greater than she could have imagined. The room, once filled with casual judgment and distraction, was now entirely focused, and even the most skeptical observers were moved by the purity of her playing. The man in the front row found himself reconsidering his own assumptions. He had laughed, thinking that her calm and modest appearance meant she was incapable of impressing anyone. He realized now how mistaken he had been. Talent, he understood, was not always loud or obvious. It could be quiet, subtle, and understated, yet more powerful than the brash displays of confidence that often commanded attention. The young woman's performance was a lesson in humility, patience, and respect for the craft, demonstrating that true mastery requires not just skill, but emotional depth and authenticity. The music she played was a reflection of everything she had experienced. The quiet moments of practice, the frustration of mistakes, the triumphs of perseverance, and the joy of creation. She poured all of that into every note, letting the piano become an extension of her emotions and experiences. The audience could sense this, even if they could not articulate it. There was a palpable connection forming between the performer and those listening. They were no longer mere spectators. They were participants in the story she was telling through her music. Each phrase carried a sense of intimacy, a direct link between her heart and theirs, and the effect was profound. The man who had laughed now felt a growing sense of respect and admiration. He had entered the hall confident in his judgment, ready to be entertained by failure. Yet he had been confronted with undeniable skill and authenticity. He recognized that his initial assumptions had been flawed, that appearances could be deceiving, and that true talent often manifests quietly, revealing itself in moments that demand attention. He was humbled, not by words or confrontation, but by the sheer force of her music and presence. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that judgment without understanding is fragile, and that the truth of one's ability can only be revealed through action. Around the hall, the audience remained captivated. Each person reacted in their own way, some with quiet reflection, some with wide-eyed astonishment, and some with subtle nods of appreciation. The room had been transformed from a casual gathering to a space of shared experience, where the impact of her performance was felt collectively. People who had initially dismissed her presence were now paying careful attention, realizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The music had broken through the walls of doubt, skepticism, and expectation, and had created a new reality in which her quiet determination and skill commanded respect. She continued with complete focus, moving seamlessly between passages, blending technical precision with emotional resonance. Every chord, every arpeggio, every subtle dynamic shift was intentional. She had mastered not just the notes, but the art of conveying meaning through sound. Her fingers moved with confidence and sensitivity, her expression reflecting the nuances of the music rather than seeking the approval of others. She had learned that true performance is not about applause or recognition, but about authenticity and connection. And in that moment, her authenticity had captivated everyone in the room. The man in the front row found himself reflecting on his own experiences, his own judgments, and the assumptions he had made about others. He realized how easy it is to underestimate people based on appearances, demeanor, or initial impressions. She had proven with quiet consistency and undeniable skill that talent and authenticity cannot be measured by such superficial criteria. He felt a mixture of awe and humility, recognizing that he had been given a lesson in perception, patience, and respect for effort and dedication. The young woman's music continued to flow, each note carefully considered, each phrase crafted to convey emotion and story. The audience felt drawn in, experiencing the journey she had prepared for them. They could sense the depth of her practice, the years of silent dedication, and the care she had put into every detail. The hall itself seemed to respond to her playing, the air vibrating with the resonance of the piano and the energy of the audience. Every listener was caught in the spell of her performance, whether they realized it or not. as the room became a shared space of emotion, reflection, and appreciation as she reached the climax of the piece. The intensity and emotion became even more apparent. She played with precision and feeling, balancing technical skill with expressive nuance. The music swelled and receded, drawing the listeners deeper into the story she was telling. The man in the front row sat in quiet contemplation, overwhelmed by the realization of how wrong he had been to judge her prematurely. The performance had transcended expectation, surpassing even the unspoken hopes of those who had arrived with open minds. He felt the power of humility, the lesson in patience, and the undeniable impact of dedication and authenticity. The final notes lingered in the hall, resonating with a sense of completion and fulfillment. The audience remained still for a moment, absorbing the depth and beauty of what they had just heard. The man in the front row exhaled slowly, his mind reflecting on the journey he had witnessed. He had laughed, he had doubted, and he had underestimated. But now he was confronted with undeniable truth. Skill, dedication, and authenticity cannot be judged superficially. The young woman had demonstrated that quiet determination, combined with patience and genuine expression, can command respect and transform perceptions. The young woman sat back for a moment, allowing the impact of the performance to settle. She did not seek applause or acknowledgement, for her satisfaction came from the act of playing itself, from the connection she had created through music. The audience, however, could not remain silent. Applause began to ripple through the hall, growing steadily as people expressed their admiration and respect. Even the man in the front row joined in, recognizing that this young woman had taught him a lesson far beyond the scope of music, a lesson in perception, humility, and the quiet power of authenticity. And as the applause continued, she prepared herself for the final piece, her focus unwavering. She knew that the performance was not about validation, but about expressing something genuine, sharing her story, and honoring the dedication that had brought her to this point. The hall had been transformed by her presence. The man who had laughed had been humbled, and the audience had been given an experience they would not soon forget. She had proven without words or confrontation that true talent is revealed through action, patience, and authenticity, and that one person, fully committed to their craft, can change the energy of a room and the perceptions of those within it.